Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome. This is formally welcome you to this year's York St John Music Production Symposium. So for those of you for whom it's the first time at one of these events, this is our annual student-led academic conference, which we've held for many years now, in which our Year 3 music production students present on their final year research projects. So why do we hold this event? Firstly, because for the third years, it really helps to enliven their final year academic research work. And the additional challenge of preparing and delivering a presentation in a genuine conference style setting. And it enables students across all 3 years of our courses to understand the relationship between the practical studies that they're engaging in throughout and the intellectual perspectives that they're encountering on the various modules in our course. So just to say, please can you give our third years, as Russ had indicated in his email earlier today, your full support during the paper streams later on this morning, for example, by thinking of a question to ask them about their work or offering an encouraging comment, which sort of indicates, that you're responding to what they do. So just a quick reminder of the schedule. In a minute, we've got our keynote. And at the end of that, they'll have a short period of time in which we can field a small number of questions. And what these will do will whet our appetite for the more extended discussion we'll have in the half-hour Q&A at the end of today. Then we'll have an interval, which gives us all time to get across to MS Teams to join the student paper streams there. So as I said in my email, you just need to go to the dedicated MS team for the symposium and then locate the paper stream that you're interested in. You can go to any of them you like. The chairs who are chairing those individual paper streams will have launched the meetings by the time you get there, so it should be clear which one you're going to go into. Once you're in there, can I just request that you stay in your respective paper stream rather than cutting between them, because I'm not sure what impact that would have on obviously how the presentations are flowing and also on the technology. So then to conclude the day, we've got a Q&A after a short interval. As I say, it's about 30 minutes, which will give you an opportunity to ask Carola, our keynote today, further questions, having had a chance to think about the things she's discussing. It's going to be chaired by Alex Dye, who I think has already been in touch with some of you, requesting you to sort of keep in mind that session and think about the kinds of comments, questions and discussion points you'd perhaps like to raise. So that's the sort of formal side of the housekeeping. So I'd like to introduce our keynote for today. It's Carola Boehm, and she is Professor of Arts and Higher Education at Staffordshire University. She has both an arts and a science background, which we appreciate on a course like ours. She's worked in both academia and the industry, which again is also very relevant to our course. She's worked as a consultant in industry, and she's an academic leader in sort of higher education thinking in her area. She's described herself as a genuine interdisciplinarian who is passionate about interdisciplinarity and creativity. She's also been a key contributor to debates within the field of music technology for many years. Done important work as well in regard to theories of cultural consumption, diversity and gatekeeping within the arts, and the relevance of these things to the situation of music professionals within the creative industries. So what she's got to talk about today is very relevant to you as music production students who in the future are going to be among the principal contributors to musical culture in the digital domain. So without further ado, I will now hand you over to Carola.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my presentation just to make sure everything goes all right. And sadly, I'm not going to see the chat that is going on, but I think Mark and the others can sort of keep hold of, because I am, as Mark suggested, I'm going to talk about the music industry, obviously, gatekeeping and fair pay. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And hopefully what I'm going to present today can contribute to some of the debates that we might be hearing during the day. So we'll see. But in short, sort of my talk will look at, well, what worked well. And we have a lot to be proud of in the creative industries. What doesn't work well, and what are we going to do about it? So it is kind of, celebrating, then looking at what we can do better, and then going into the future. And of course, the pandemic has really thrown us a big curve. And that's why I do want to spend a bit of time in relation to that, and also what it means to current debates. And actually, one of the most current debates, and many of you will actually be aware of, the current broken record campaign. I actually spent the day before yesterday listening to MPs grilling the CEOs of the major record companies about, remuneration of artists, remuneration of musicians. So it was really, really insightful. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. But then I'm going to talk about, how can we think about the future as collectively, as the creative industries, as the music industry, but also that allows individuals like yourselves to position yourself in such a way that you can storm the weather, the future weathers, whether that's pandemics or economic issues in relation to that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So initially, so first of all, of course, what worked well. And, one has to always caveat something with, this was before the crisis, because the pandemic crisis, because the pandemic was such a incision into where we were. But of course, the creative industries were doing really, really well. And before I actually even show some of the statistics that many of you will know inside and out, I just want to also just pause and say, of course, what defines the creative industries is different depending on who does the definition. So you will hear words like creative industry, creative economy, creative sector, cultural industry. And depending on who specifies something, certain sectors might be in or out, whether publishing is in, whether tourism is out, those aspects. Sometimes if different countries put forward numbers in relation to the creative industry, sometimes it's not quite measuring the same thing. So that's maybe a slight caveat. And I have on this slide, for instance, the government definition in relation to the difference between the creative industry, as they define it, and the creative economy. And they make a differentiation where, as you can see from the right side of the slide, the creative industries is made up of the creative occupations within the creative industries and the support jobs within those industries. So that's the creative industries, but they then have this larger concept of the creative economy, which includes creative occupations outside of the creative industries. So that's just to bear in mind, because depending on which metrics you use, it does depend. And from our perspective, we're all creators. I tend to use the creative sector in terms of the definition of that. But looking at our success story, and this is a publication from February 2020, so from last year, the beginning of the last year, where the crisis hadn't quite hit. But we can be really proud because the creative industries grew 5 times faster than the rest of the UK economy. So we are really a powerhouse. And you will have heard that before, but I do tend to always foreground that, because when anybody tells you, you want to be a musician, you want to be an artist, there's no money to be made, we are one of the largest sectors, the driving forces within the creative economy. And of course, before the pandemic hit, we were also some of the most resilient sectors. And I'm going to talk about why we didn't weather the storm very much in terms of the pandemic. But it's just, a really good success story for Britain. And of course, we feel in Britain, we're leading within Europe. We're leading in terms of the creative industries. Also, in terms, of course, the export industry, again, before Brexit, before the pandemic, it was a big powerhouse, and 12% of the total UK exports were from the creative industries. So again, it just shows that creative powerhouse that Britain has become over the last decades. And it was a struggle of also advocating for the creative industries, like, colleagues that are within your sort of academic teams, and maybe yourselves as well, to really foreground how important the creative industries are, because as we know, it's a very fragmented industry. So it's not like IBM, big, gigantic companies. It's thousands and thousands of individuals, 2, 3, 4 person companies. It's very, very fragmented. And also in terms of job creation, of course, we know that the creative industries jobs were growing much faster than the rest of the country. So jobs were increasing 3 times as fast as the average of the UK. And you can see from that graph, of course, that it sort of differs from different types of regions in the UK, you know, with Scotland almost being 5 times faster. So the growth of jobs in the creative industries was 5 times faster than the growth in Scotland in all sorts of other areas. You know, and you can see the sort of makeup there, and you can find yourself in Yorkshire in relation to that. So it is a big success story. And of course, you know, one could even say just before the pandemic crisis hit, you know, we finally managed to persuade the government to really see this powerhouse, this creative powerhouse, and really invest in it. And of course, you know, at the pinnacle of that, I guess, evolution, you could say, was the creative industries sector deal, which is a sector deal which really looks at strategically investing into the sector in order to help the country, the whole country's economy, move forward. So the creative industry sector deal was announced in 2018. And of course, there was a new industry-led Creative Industries Trade and Investment Board formed, which then sort of informs the strategy going forward. And so, for instance, at that time, there was a suggestion to increase the UK creative exports by 50%. So, you know, how can we invest in that to even, you know, power this more? Because it's probably fair to say for the last 30 years, you know, the creative industries have been left to themselves and they've done really, really well. You know, how much more would they be able to contribute and produce if you really invest in them? So there was this recognition that creative industries jobs have grown 3 times faster than in all UK jobs. And here's another little statistics: 1 in 8 businesses were a creative business. And you can see that, you know, I wrote here is a creative business, and suddenly I'm using the past tense, and it just shows that, of course, the crisis has hit. And I've in the past actually criticized the creative industry sector deal, and I've criticized it because, as I will present actually later on, I suggest that the UK is hung up on Culture 2.0. So at the moment, you will not know what Culture 2.0 is, and I'm going to go into it. But I think it's crucial to understand why we're hung up on Culture 2.0, which is holding us back, and some of the dilemmas that artists have also in terms of fair pay and the relationship with their labels has something to do with the business models which are at the moment the norm, which are immersed in Culture 2.0. And my critique on the industry strategy that the government has adopted is that they are hung up on this, you know, model, which, you know, is not quite the past. And, you know, there's a lot of money still to be made from Culture 2.0, but it's certainly not the future. And hopefully, you know, that's by the end of this talk, you will sort of have another kind of conceptualization to think about, you know, how do I position myself in the future? How do I position my business in the future? That is much more future oriented rather than just dealing with the current situation. And I was going to talk about diversity a bit, but I sort of realized I wanted to emphasize some other things a bit more. So I have to admit I cut the whole diversity section out. But, you know, just to mention, of course, we do know we have, you know, at the moment we live in this moment of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, where we can really push forward in terms of diversity. And although the music industry as such, the for-profit music industry, the music sector, is of course much more diverse than if you look at the public-funded music sector, so arts and not-for-profit sectors. So we are doing better, but there's a lot that we can push more, especially when you go into the higher management. So you see artists, you know, there's a lot of diversity within musicians, but when you look at who's managing the musicians, who are the CEOs of these companies, then the diversity goes down. But I'm not going to talk about that, but because I would want to go into this pandemic resilience. What of course we've seen, and you might have experienced that in the last month, that of course the COVID crisis with various lockdowns, different, you know, it was good and bad for different sections of the industry. So we could see that the lockdowns was brilliant for big streaming services. So Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, all of them have actually reported substantial increases in revenues, okay? And of course, that's crucial for us in the music industry because many of us have our content that we produced on those streaming services. there was also an exponential increase of consumers for these online streaming services. And of course, you will see yourself also in that sector, music audiences, through laptops, through smartphones, we were able to access free music from all sorts of different things. And of course, during the lockdown, if my experience is anything to go by, I was able to go to events virtually that I wouldn't have been able to go if I had to go there physically. And the statistics seem to indicate that audiences increased because they had more easier access to these events. So it was actually, in some strange way, also good for music audiences who wanted to experience diverse cultural offers and music offers. For labels and music record companies, especially those that had negotiated contracts with the streaming services, their revenue stayed stable or even increased. So they were also okay. So in some weird way, the lockdowns were actually specifically bad for artists, and specifically artists who actually had to now rely on streaming income because their live income was suddenly falling away. So all the concerts were, of course, live music completely collapsed. And that created a situation where suddenly individuals realized, especially artists, musicians, and you saw that probably in the news, musicians who had an income from live concerts, from other sorts of revenues, whether that's selling merchandise at live concerts or whether that's having all sorts of different kinds of licenses. Suddenly, most of the income was coming from their streaming, from their, from their content, which was on the streaming platforms. And it was actually many of them, and you might have seen that in the press, many of them were shocked how small that income actually was. So actually, in some ways, the COVID crisis and the lockdowns demonstrated how unfair and unequitable remuneration there was actually there from streaming. And of course, that hit the music sector also quite hard. And of the most hardest hit industries within the creative industries, the most hardest hit sectors actually within the UK economy, it was actually the creative industries and tourism. And, what was reported, just some numbers, 31% turnover loss compared to 2019. So these figures all come from sort of projected economic impact done in June 2020 from Oxford Economics, which is a big company which does a lot of sort of impact measures and projections, economic projections. And so we can see that, there are, of course, regional differences. Half of this shortfall was also in London, 29 billion shortfall of value added. And the next big hit was actually the Southeast. And of course, employment dropped. And of course, again, the creative industries, we have on the one hand, just normal employment, and that dropped by 122,000, despite the coronavirus job retention scheme. But actually, under self-employed, there was a sort of notion that around 287,000 jobs were lost. And that was just June 2020. So you can see it had a big impact. 75% of individuals reported that they expected an income fall of more than 50%. So if you imagine, your monthly income that you have coming in, cut that in half. And do you think you can survive off that? And it's certainly a real struggle. So it was bad. And of course, there are different kinds of sectors in the creative industries. We can see from this slide, crafts, 53%, advertising 44%. Theater, of course, was hardest hit because it's almost solely relies on live kind of performances. We can see radio wasn't hit as hard. Audio, there was no data in relation to that. But of course, it can be expected that a fair proportion of audio, specifically in terms of broadcasts, continued. And of course, where losses were made were broadcasts covering live events. Again, where live events is involved, that of course completely collapsed. And you can see right at the bottom on the right, games, although we didn't have data, they proved to be quite resilient. And I'm emphasizing this again because you would actually think that music, the music industry is quite digitally immersed. It's a digital music industry almost now. And yes, we have live performances, but the recording industry is sophisticated, and you would actually wonder, why did it collapse so much where a substantial amount of our content is actually all out there? These are again statistics from April 2020, and I'm not going to go, I'm not going to go into each line of that, but maybe just to emphasize, again, at the bottom under music and live music, of course, the total collapse of live music, and the notion that the recovery will take at least 3 to 4 years to get back to 2019 levels. So, of course, how I, started this talk with this fabulous success story, and I think we have to work our way back to those levels because of the crisis. But then, of course, other sectors have as well. But some sectors have done quite well. And of course, that's why I want to sort of go into this whole debate, the broken record campaign, and what is happening in relation to that. And I should actually say that there are two sort of to get involved in those campaigns, in terms of social media, hashtag broken record and hashtag fix streaming. Those are just some of the campaigns that are going on, hashtag fair pay, because this crisis, as I said, gave artists and collectors like unions or campaigns a real understanding of how small amounts actually artists get through streaming and why that actually is. So put a spotlight on that, because you could actually argue, especially those artists who have a lot of online content and they got a lot of plays, you should actually expect that they don't have to be bailed out by the government, through various job retention schemes or support schemes or furloughs or, any kind of those. But it just seemed a really strange thing. So that took the attention, and end of last year it was announced that there would be an inquiry by the Department of Culture, Media and Sports to look at the economics of music streaming. And these events happened during November, December and January, and the last one was actually 2 days ago. So that was the one where I listened in to MPs grilling the chief executives of the 3 top record companies, and it was a really, really interesting event actually. And of course, because it's in Parliament, it means that it's recorded and it's transcribed. So those interested in that, can go back and just listen in and look at this issue. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in that to go there, because it's also showed how MPs were trying to understand what is actually happening there and how difficult that aspect actually is. And this inquiry looks at this economic impact that music streaming is having on artists, but also, of course, on record labels, but also inside of the sustainability of the wider music industry. So, of course, if our artists can't sustain themselves through the income through streaming, then it jeopardizes the industry of the future. So we have to get it right. And of course, as part of that, they looked at business models. They looked at long-term effects of streaming platforms. They looked at influence on consumers, how that shifted, how consumers react. And of course, they also wanted to look at protecting the industry and the copyright directive, especially because we're falling out of the European Union's copyright directives now. But I haven't seen evidence that they are looking at that so far, but there might be more meetings to come. So the questions that MPs asked in relation to that were actually quite tough. So, as I mentioned, COVID demonstrated how much artists get actually from royalties and streaming. And so the chief executives from Warner Music UK, Sony Music UK, Universal Music UK were being grilled by these MPs. And you could see that even the MPs actually had a real difficulties of understanding how revenues and royalties actually work, because it's such a complex industry. Invited were also PPL and PRS, and I'm sure that these 2 organizations, but just in case, just to remind ourselves, in terms of PPL and PRS, PPL is, of course, the Phonographic Performance Limited, organization which collects and distributes money for the use of recorded music on behalf of record companies and performers. And I should actually note, PPL is actually owned by the record companies. So you know, their stakeholders are much more actually the record companies than the performers. PRS, of course, which is PRS for Music Limited, but came out of two organizations, Performing Rights Society and Mechanical Copyright Protection Society. And that collects and distributes money for the use of the music composition and lyrics on behalf of authors, songwriters, and composers and publishers. You know, in that divide, you could tell that MPs had to also struggle to understand that there are two different organizations which deal with two different aspects of music performances, public performances. And of course, you know, and some of you might know that back in 2018, there was an initiative to create a new entity out of PPL and PRS, bringing them together so that you could have just one music license which deals with both. But of course, these are crucial in this debate, because who is actually collecting and what they're actually collecting, and then allowing labels to distribute the money in relation to place is quite important. So there was a constructive debate on possible solutions in the future that would involve PPL and PRS, and that's something to watch out for, because I think those, you know, those entities might in the future have much more remit in terms of dealing with streaming. They already have a remit in relation to radio plays. As you know, if your music is being played by radio somewhere, a spreadsheet does a tick and says, you know, there was at least one play. With online streaming, it's very much different. And of course, to put it onto that kind of system needs some kind of agency like PPL and PRS, which keeps track of that. And that was the question also for MPs, you know, why are there no collective licensing for recording? And there are issues with safe harbor provisions, and safe harbor provisions don't only deal with the music industry. And if you remember what that term actually meant, you know, it's being bandied about in the media. It is this notion of online platforms being not culpable in relation to the content that other people put on there. You know, so of course the big debate also included Google platforms, YouTube, Facebook. You know, the safe harbor provision is at the moment in debate, because it allows those big streaming companies to simply say, we just provide the platform, we're not responsible for the content. But actually that's really problematic in terms of music licenses. And it was an interesting debate also in terms of some of the contractual arrangements. So there was a very interesting section where the chief executive of Universal Music was asked about the global license deal, their global license deal with Spotify, and how it would allow Spotify to reduce royalties if it provides more revenues. And the MPs actually asked, okay, so you're getting more revenues now from Spotify with this agreement that you've made with Spotify. Have you transferred that to artists? And that question was probably asked like 5 to 6 times and wasn't answered. So you know, you can see the tensions, and I'll go into that a bit more. But MP certainly explored the idea that streaming should be licensed like radio, so that there is somebody tracking of what has been downloaded, and that revenues can then go to those individuals that created the content that has been streamed. And in a nutshell, and I try to, you know, and you know, some of you will know that in and out, but in a nutshell, I sort of try to depict, you know, what the issues here are and what has been discussed. And of course, we know that artists in generally, specifically if they want to go with a mainstream label, they have a contract with that label. And actually consumers have a contract with the streaming platforms like Spotify and YouTube and TikTok. And then it's actually the labels or the record companies which have hidden negotiations and contracts with the streaming platforms. So one of the things that came out of this inquiry was how much they felt in competition with each other. They didn't want to answer the questions in relation to these contracts because they felt they were competing with each other. So they said, I'm going to give that confidentially, but I'm not going to say it out loud here because it's a public document and it's part of our market edge that we negotiate these contracts individually. And I think that also provides a big problem because the lack of transparency means that artists just don't have any leverage. You know, they first of all, their contracts are also quite often based on non-disclosure agreements, so they can't talk about the requirements for their contracts, but also what the labels negotiate with the streaming platforms that hold the artist's content. They don't know those negotiations, so they can't actually make an argument that I'm not getting enough for my streamed content. So there is a lack of transparency. And if I would say what I heard in those mornings of how the record companies are actually arguing, it's probably fair to say that they're on the one hand very, very defensive. They said it's how the market works, so that the competitive does not allow transparency of those contractual cultures. There was a lot of blame going on. It's not us, it's the streaming platforms. And this notion of safe harbor agreements doesn't allow us to remunerate artists as good. So, it's not us narrative. There were also victim narratives, so the big labels, of course, that said we managed to come out of the industry crisis. So if you remember, 10 years back, 15 years back, there was a whole discussion about the music industry is with streaming is going, going out of work. And they had these narratives in there. We managed to come out of the industry crisis by negotiating with streaming services. And, to me, of course, that means that they equate the music industry with the labels only, forgetting that, all of us are part of the music industry. So it's an interesting aspect. There was a narrative which suggests you don't understand. You don't understand how that works. It's so complex. Automatic licensing or equitable remuneration, which would be a better way of doing it for artists. It doesn't quite work like that. Streaming is not radio. That was an argument which was mentioned again and again. Then there was an argument that it will automatically get better because streaming is still on the increase. That means that artists who are at the moment not making a living from their streaming services, whilst they already have, thousands and thousands of downloads, in the future, they will have more downloads and they will be able to sustain themselves. They also had an argument that if you change the way things are, you will destroy the industry. So the UK needs to stay competitive. We've lived through the decline. We are starting to grow. But of course, again, the industry has grown. It's rather the labels, it's equating, the labels are equating themselves with the music industry, and it's just one part of the industry. So they have these survivor narratives and this blame culture as well. And I think, again, for me, and I'm going to go into that just now, this means that big labels are hung up on business models which come from this culture 2.0 context. So again, before I go into explaining what culture 2.0 is, as we mentioned, safe harbor provision. So these are the friction points, the things to watch is in terms of what's happening with the debate. Safe harbor is a concept that many of you will know. And I just want to quote Mills from Music Business Worldwide, contextualizing them within the music industry. And she said, they were not intended to provide fortress walls behind which companies could build $million businesses on content that had not been cleared. They were never intended to become a de facto license. And license, of course, here means, that artists license their use of their performances to platforms. And because we don't have a provision in relation to that, they're just hiding behind that. So friction points to watch are also this lack of transparency of labor contracts, which of course created the situation that before the crisis, nobody really tackled this issue. And I think in some ways we can thank the various campaigns to have really elevated that, and especially at a time like this, because many musicians should have been actually able to make money also through this crisis because their streaming increased exponentially, but they just didn't see that income reflect that. So there is this big resistance of labels. All three of those record companies resisted and said, we can't adopt automatic licensing or equitable remuneration like it happens on radio. But actually interesting that when PRS and PPL were questioned, they said, yeah, if we, pass a law where that has to be the case, we can do that because they are part of the digital world where that already happens. So if you think about BBC, is it called BBC Sounds, the BBC Sounds player, that already is based on equitable remuneration. So if your music is is played on BBC Sounds, then somewhere there is a notch that your music has been at least played once, and you get remuneration for that. And of course, within this friction which is happening, there are new services coming online. So, many of you have heard about Deezer as a sort of alternative kind of Spotify. And of course, Deezer has always supported user-centric streaming or user-centric payment models, which really track what is being downloaded. And as I mentioned, PSS and PBL could step in to become a new royalty super regulator for streaming. And another thing just to mention, and that I found strange, and I don't know how the debate evolves, but independent labels were not represented in that inquiry. So that's something to watch out in terms of the debate of what their reactions are in relation to what's coming out of this inquiry. And of course, actually on the same day, there was a debate in Parliament about live touring, live music touring in Europe and the impact of Brexit. And that hit actually the news much more than this debate, but so there are some challenges. Some of you might know this Earl, and I'm just putting it out there because I have to admit I didn't. This is a record deal simulator, and it was mentioned by MPs who were actually suggesting, we wanted to understand how actually deals are being created. So if you don't, it's great if you do. And it was never quite clear if that was the kind of correct way of calculating. So, of course, the record companies didn't actually want to specify whether the example that they gave of, when an artist gets $1 of profit, of net profit, then the label gets 1.65 million. So that's what this record deal simulator actually suggests. It's what the MP asked all three chief executives, and all of them basically didn't say no or yes, but waffled quite a lot. So there is a lot of lack of transparency. This might not be right, but it's an interesting simulator that is online. And of course, it's part of the, broken record campaign. So it's actually quite nice. So my sort of conclusion from that kind of experience of experiencing CEOs trying to also make clear what their position is within the music industry, and MPs trying to get at the situation of why is it that so many artists have complained about the income in relation to their online presence. Again, I come back to this notion of there are a lot of people hung up in 2.0. So this is where I'm going into this next session, and I'm going to talk about what I actually mean by that. And culture 3.0, this conceptualization, and it's actually a conceptualization of a cultural evolution, how we as humans, as society, engage with arts and culture. And it goes from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. And it wasn't put forward by me. It was put forward by a professor of economics in Italy, Luigi Sacco, who actually advised the European Union in terms of its creative industry, a creative sector, and a creative economy kind of strategy. And so I'm going to just talk about that. And it's fairly simple. It's a very powerful conceptualization. So culture 1.0, and we can see that historically, if you think patronage, then you've got the concept already pat. You understand what this concept is about. And of course, in culture 1.0, there are limited audiences. And of course, I've got that image of a flute concert of Frederick the Great from 1852. So we have aristocracy who are the gatekeepers. And so the cultural offering is determined by patrons' tastes and interests. There are no structural markets or technologies for reproduction. And of course, a key sort of aspect of culture 1.0 is that it absorbs value. So the money that needs to be invested to put on this type of culture 1.0 needs to be made elsewhere. Okay, so that's culture 1.0. And you could understand that historically, but I always say, these layers, we have culture 1.0 types of cultural engagements going on at the moment here in the UK. So you could see the BBC Proms as a modern example of culture 1.0. It's funded probably by the Arts Council, by taxpayers' money. So, there's gatekeepers. Somebody decides what is valid to be performed. So it's a culture 1.0. And Luigi Sacco, of course, has a sort of a nuanced approach. So there are different types of, culture 1.1, culture 1.2, because there are different types of patronage types. So of course, the first picture in terms of the 18th, 19th century was sort of classical patronage, but we also have public patronage. Every time you go into a concert and you pay a ticket for let's say a classical concert, which sort of patronizes that kind of event, that's public patronage. It might not pay for everything. Taxpayers' money has built the classical concert halls and stuff like that. So it's still patronage. And this culture 1.0, of course, as we know, it has created also its own sort of differentiations and also challenges, because it was seen to be a component for human development. So public patronage, when sort of, we say in music, of course, the public stormed the concert halls, especially in the 19th century. Suddenly, it wasn't just the aristocracy which experienced music. Suddenly, people could go to these concerts. But with that, still the state decides what deserves to be patronized. So there's still, this gatekeeping there. And it creates this divide between high and lowbrow culture. So that emerged, of course, in the 19th century. And of course, we still suffer from that in the popular music field, because there's this divide. Much less than it was 20 years ago. In the UK, much less than on the continent. And that's, of course, why Sacco also suggests that Europe is hung up on culture 1.0. But with public patronage, you also have audience expansion, but you still have culture value absorption. So, of course, some people have said in terms of museums and concerts, that's mainly a redistribution from citizens who don't attend to those who do. So you take taxpayers' money to pay for the concert halls, and then, only the people benefit who go to that. So that's culture 1.x. Culture 2.0, if you think copyright, intellectual property right, then you're in the right place. That's culture 2.0. And the images, almost immediately you can understand this concept. We've got technological innovation, which supports mass production. So think about the music industry, think about the film industry. And of course, we still have this remnant of high, lowbrow conceptualization, which basically then means that commercialization in general is being seen as problematic. So we've probably all suffered that to a certain extent. Within that, we also have unlimited reproducibility of creative content. We've got very large audiences. And of course, we produce a significant turnover and profits. And of course, the success of the creative industry has really shown that. So as quintessential examples that I've chosen, of course, is Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, 1973. And of course, there's David Bowie in the same year in a performance, but also saying this is not just historic. So on the right side, I've got Leviathan, which is from 2014, a sort of augmented virtual reality, augmented reality kind of experience. So of course, with sort of XR, AR, there are loads of kinds of ways of doing culture 2.0. And sort of my contention is, of course, that we in the UK are a bit hung up on 2.0. And you'll understand what I mean when we go to 3.0. But 2.0 has also its nuances. It has, of course, is part of that development where we have mass urbanization. So cities get really large, the 20th century of that. Cultural markets emerge. We have suddenly a creative industry, and whether we call it culture industry or a creative industry, depending on how we say, but these markets emerge, and there are, again, nuances in relation to that. So the pictures that I have here, I fear are all from the city in which my university is based. Of course, on the left is an old picture from the potteries, the ceramics industry. And as you might know, Stoke-on-Trent produces something like 80% of the ceramics in the UK. So it's what I would call a quintessential a deep creative cluster, because it was one of the first industries which produced en masse, has mass production of creative content, people painting on plates, people making beautiful vases. So in terms of the craft sector, you could say it's the quintessential deep creative cluster. And of course, then I have Discharge. So some of you who are punk fans might actually know that. Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing album, which the band comes from Stoke-on-Trent, and it's been called, the most influential punk record of all times. So that's could be seen as the counter mainstream, whereas proto-industry, the potteries could be seen as proto-industry. And then as an example, as fan ecologies, I just have cartoon and comic arts. And of course, again, in Stoke-on-Trent at my university, it was the first university which had a comic and cartoon art degree. So those are just some examples. So in terms of culture 2.0, think copyright, think IPR, so intellectual property rights. And of course, here we've got the music industry there, we've got the film industry there, and we've got the AR, the future AR industry there as well. And as I mentioned, if you look at the 2018 creative industry sector deal that the government put forward, it's full of this kind of stuff. It's hung up on Culture 2.0. It's wanting to build the new Hollywood in London or Manchester. It's building on augmented reality kind of apps. Can we be the leader in augmented alternative type of immersive realities? It's that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of money to be made there in terms of Culture 2.0, but that's the present. It's not the future. So what is the future? So Culture 3.0, we still have digital content production, we still have digital connectivity, and we have these ubiquitously available production tools. We have mass distribution of content without mediators, open platforms, social media, co-production, often being democratic co-production. I'm going to emphasize that, co-production. Because, of course, there's constantly shifting roles of content producers and users. And, some of the examples, and again, it becomes very, very easily understandable. For some of you might have played massive online multiplayer online games, Destiny. I've got Destiny down there. So, of course, there's a company who creates that game, but there are loads of users who produce artwork, who produce videos of their plays, who produce debates on YouTube, and it creates its own revenue. So who's the content producer and user shifts? These roles are shifting almost all the time. And of course, also culture no longer is an aspect of free time, but it's entrenched in fabric of daily life. So we don't have to make time to go to a concert anymore. We've got Spotify, we've got Band in a Box, we've got our smartphones everywhere. So it's completely entrenched. And as an example, here's, of course, the leaf trombone. I don't know if you know that. It was an app which, is now probably 10, 12, 14 years old or something like that. Maybe not quite as old like that. But, you blow into it and it's like a leaf trombone app, and you can have an impromptu concert with, 5, 10, 50 people all over the world, just from one moment to the other. So there are no predetermined market channel bottlenecks in relation to that. And, as another example, of course, SoundCloud fits into this kind of ecosystem as well. With that, we have a blurring of active and passive participation. So I'm not, I might be listening to a podcast one moment, and the next moment, hey, I'm uploading a podcast with something. So it becomes very difficult to understand, who's the producer, who's the consumer. And of course, this prosumer, that concept of the prosumer comes in there. This technological innovation allows massive shared and shareable production of content, instant diffusion and circulation. And of course, the production of value moves to the social domain. So we are, that ability to engage musically or creatively, it works in all sorts of lives, and it helps us to function in a social domain. And of course, there are sort of evidences how it connects to all sorts of civic functioning, innovation, of course, welfare, sustainability. So, all these kinds of things. We know that specifically in terms of welfare. We know certainly, if my experience anything to go by, music kept me sane. Online access to music and arts kept me sane through various lockdowns. As an example, I should actually say I've got here Imogen Heap as well, and her mycelia, which is putting distributed ledgers into a sort of system which allows then a co-sharing of the revenue created to everyone who's involved in that. So if you think Culture 3.0, co-production, that's the key point there, then you've got that concept. You understand that concept. And of course, there are sort of, I should actually emphasize that I've given a lot of examples which are digitally enhanced. And of course, digital availability does support Culture 3.0, but it doesn't have to be. There are other ways which I would say are typical Culture 3.0. So if you think about participatory street festivals, where you spin a story with theater makers, but the audience is part of the story. That's typical, in my opinion, Culture 3.0. Or this woolen-claden piano. Now, from a Culture 1.0, some people might say, "Wow, is this art? Is this really art?" And of course, you now don't have to define it as art. You can say, "Well, it's Culture 3.0. It makes all of our lives a bit more creative, who plays on it, who listens to it, doesn't matter. It just makes that living here in this space a bit more creative, and that's fine, and it creates value for us. So that's Culture 3.0. So, just in a sort of kind of, concluding towards that, and these are all sort of examples of where this cultural engagement, the evolution of cultural engagement kind of moves towards to. So we have Culture 1.0, think patronage, Culture 2.0, think copyright, Culture 3.0, think co-production. And I've got here some examples, if we move into this Culture 3.0, so of course crowdfunding allows, is in that ecosystem, podcasting, because there are feeds that nobody can gatekeep, it's very democratic, falls into that. There are also, the alternatives to Spotify, Deezer. And of course, we've got a sort of alternatives to Spotify, Sonstream and Stoke-on-Trent, which was an independent label initially, but is creating a sort of remuneration system which pays per play, pays also the artists per play. So there are things on the move here, which is very interesting because it fits in my concept under Culture 3.0. Now, I should actually emphasize that I'm not advocating that we all move to Culture 3.0, but that we need a balance. We need a healthy ecosystem, which has Culture 1.0 types of cultural engagement, Culture 2.0 kinds of cultural engagement, as well as Culture 3.0. So, of course, if we have now an industry strategy which only supports Culture 2.0, we're missing out on the future. And I think that's what, the current industry strategy deal is actually doing. We're missing out in the cutting edge. But it also means for us individually, do we want to support business models like, Sony, UK? Do we want to support record companies that are still so immersed in Culture 2.0 rather than looking at, are there models that allow me to go into the future in relation to that? And I would actually, you could conceptualize these also in terms of a different type of context. You could contextualize Culture 1.0 as sort of high individualism. I'm not going to go into that too much. The cultural turn is, of course, where suddenly the creative industries become very important, and creativity as such and IP becomes very important. In co-production turn, there are a lot of people in the business world and the economy already talking about this co-production turn, that the economy is turning to co-production means, and that's going to be more in the future. But it's the question of if we're going to let Asia sort of monopolize that concept. It's already coming quite strong in relation to that. Of course, 1.0, the center was Europe, 2.0 was the US, and I would say the UK, specifically the music industry. So in conclusion, I would say keep the pressure up, various hashtags, represent the various campaigns, and I could add to fixed streaming and broken records, various other sort of campaigns, tax capital, not workers, big companies, pay your taxes, fair wages, delete privilege and class. There was a little task. I'm doing this creative challenge, January creative challenge at the moment, where every little day you get a little exercise. And one was to paint a sort of rap type utopian reality. And that's sort of my list of my wish list of what the future could look like. It's not actually utopia. It is actually a potential reality. And it seems like a big list. But all of that is actually quite simple to fix in terms of thinking about, how we deal with taxes, how we deal with democracy, how do we deal with fair wages and the balance between those, wealth distribution. It is actually quite easy to fix. But so I would actually conclude on this and say, keep the pressure up in relation to fixed streaming and broken record. And as I mentioned, it is possible to still have an insight into the parliamentary inquiry that will be now there for a long time. And there are the transcripts there. And it was a very, very interesting couple of hours of, who squirmed, who didn't, who offered constructive ways of the future in relation to these issues. So I'm going to leave it like that, and I'm going to close. I'm going to see if I can see if there are questions. Yes, I can leave that up, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carola. Really, really interesting loads in there to think about. Yes, so we're quite close to the end, so I just wanted of this first part. So we've got time to field a couple of questions, if anybody has those. I've asked if people can use the Q&A box if they do wish to ask anything specific, and then we can bring you forward so that you're able to actually articulate and elaborate a little bit on what you want to say. We can pause a moment. Obviously, it's a text-based system. People.
Yes, and it was a lot. And the Culture 3.0 concept is not very well known, sadly, but it allows us, especially in the music industry, to really understand also what's going on if we take a step back of why there are these tensions.
Yes. Okay, so I can see that Russ has asked a question, and I've just asked if Angela can bring him forward. Can you see Russ's question there, Carola, in the box?
Oh, yes, I can. Yeah. How can the UK best develop a strategy for 3.0? Well, I think one of the things, or do you want to clarify, Russ?
No, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah,
you know you like to talk, Russ.
I think we've spoken about this a lot over the years, but I think what I think with Brexit and everything that's going on, good or bad or whatever, we have a clear opportunity, or the government does, to create strategies that help rather than hinder. Ideas or concepts of what that strategy could look like for Culture 3.0?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, as I sort of presented, it fits into this conceptualization that 2.0 is hung up on IP. Now, I have to say, we in the music industry are also hung up on IP. We feel it protects our intellectual, producing, we've grown up with that. But I think we have to understand how we manage our content in relation to the future, because of course IP is not protecting artists anymore. As we know, we can sell it off and it doesn't matter anymore. So I would actually also then look at, okay, so what are 3.0 types of ways of dealing with IP? And you can look at open source models, you can look at, even Wikipedia, how it deals with collaborative and co-production and co-creation and co-ownership of a process. There are loads of, ways of doing it. But and of course, the more people are contributing to an artifact, a piece of music, then suddenly IP becomes, how it's done legally at the moment becomes not possible to manage anymore. And of course, but the government, and that's where I would love to see us as an industry to push back. The government is still hung up on IP. And of course, we know universities are as well. And I think that beckons back to this notion of 2.0 kind of thinking, that we need to be able to commodify IP in order to move forward. But if you think about it, yes, a house is a physical thing. Ownership of a house, if I have a house, then Russ, you can't have that house because I have it already. But if I have a piece of music, you can have it as well. And as long as the artist gets benefit from it, there's no worry about, it's a completely different thing. And I think we know that in terms of copyright in the music industry, lawyers that are experts in copyright say it's a wild west at the moment. So we have to tackle that, but we have to just come off our own horse and say, maybe we have to do IP completely differently.
It leads me on to thinking we both were there when Imogen Heap sort of started talking about blockchains and things, and even then that was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. Do you think that's going to be the answer for all of those who are involved in production?
I'm a big fan of blockchains. I would love to see more companies implement, even independent labels, just implement a blockchain. And of course, what a blockchain does is to look at who has been involved at every moment in that chain of processing. At the end, there might be a performance, but there might be one ticket seller who's worked for 2 hours on preparing the desk, and that person might get 0.05% of every ticket sold. The blockchains will allow you to do that. The person who sold the T-shirts, the person who's scripted the song, the person who's performed the song, and you can actually implement in these smart contracts, which are part of the blockchain, a sort of relationship that you have with everyone who is part of the team, who co-produces that. So suddenly co-ownership is, and that's why I'm saying co-production, the technologies are there. And that's where the big companies, and it's not just the music industry companies, it's all big companies, are running away from that because they are desperately to hold on to something that they can monetize. And that democratization is a real threat to their revenues.
Okay, thanks, Russ. Yeah, so we've got Shannon has a question as well, and I think she's going to be brought up in a second. And I think actually this is you can see that question there, Carola.
Yeah.
It's quite a large question, that, so it could be one that could expand further a bit later as well. But Shannon, if you just want to kind of
with your talk on keeping up the pressure in 3.0, what can we do? What do you think we can do as young people coming into the industry to support the development into 3.0?
Yeah, and it's a difficult one. And I think there are different levels, and everyone, has a sort of personal consideration of what they can do with that, and of course one can get involved in those campaigns, but it might be as simple of the choice between Deezer and Spotify, having sort of ethical choices in relation and looking into those, researching a bit of, how does Spotify deal with artists? Do they have a direct, relationship with them? Supporting rather different kinds of services. So I think that we all can do on a smaller level. And then there are bigger things that we can do on a bigger level, being involved much more in campaign. And even just, helping with that broken record campaign, because I sort of realized how the momentum built up. And it was quite difficult at the beginning to really get that momentum going, and it's just by following Tom Gray from the Broken Record campaign, that's a way to support it.
Thank you. And would you also suggest for even just as many people just to listen in, like for example with that the MC, I can't
The Enquiry.
Yeah, the podcast, well, not podcast, the conversation which we can listen back into. Would you suggest for as many people to listen back as possible?
Well, the listening in probably doesn't put more pressure on. It allows maybe you to get an understanding of, also where the record companies are coming from and where the divide is, the perception of artists versus the perception of record companies. And I should actually, just to be fair, of course, the record companies have had a real difficult time when the streaming came on.
Mm-hmm.
But, in the end, I sort of, my sort of interpretation of that is that they made a bad deal for artists with the streaming companies. They made a deal which sustained themselves. They didn't make a deal that benefited artists. And I think they were pulled over the table. So again, coming back to, I think it's interesting to listen into that in relation to understanding it. But, it might be more effective, as you said yourself, in terms of understanding, yes, and then making choices that support the industry, that supports your fellow artists. We've seen in other sectors, challenges in relation to some of the secrecy, for instance, and of course in the record industry, it's quite substantially there. One artist can't talk about their contract with them, but actually when that was an issue with gender pay, so the difference between pay between females and males, there was a whole campaign of everyone disclosing their salary for there to be a sort of understanding of what the problem actually is, and then raising awareness, So I think as a sector, maybe if we go into that sector and you're the emerging talent that's the future industry, being aware of those and pushing on those doors, whether that's just disclosing some of the aspects of the contract or whether that's pushing for campaigns or, supporting those artists who are pushing in that direction, that's already quite a lot.
Yeah. I think it's important to listen in and of course understand what you're doing first, but without making any proper actions. And so you keep talking, but you don't do anything. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you
I should
very much
say,
for that.
of course, there is the opportunity, and that might be a good thing. If you do listen into the inquiry, get involved in that. So the deadline for that inquiry was actually back in November, or September, actually. So, of course, they were asking the industry, including labels, but including artists. And that's us. We all could have written into that inquiry. And sometimes, of course, it's not very, very publicly available, the knowledge that these things are going on. And that's maybe on us, that we have to also, that our sector organizations, that UK Music is, of course, talks on our behalf, but that's, they let us know, can we voice our concerns and put inquiries in?
Yeah, I think there should be more efforts in terms of publicising these sorts of events, because I'm sure a lot of people, including myself, would have been more interested to listen and take part. And then there might be some people who might be sceptical on whether these perhaps have been done on purpose to ensure that less people learn. Because again, like with the lack of transparency within the industry and also in government terms, not to get too deep in politics, but I think a lot of people have some sort of mistrust. So I think it's definitely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Just from the time point of view now, so we'll have to draw this to the first part to a close. So we've got about 15 minutes or so for you to go and grab a cup of tea or something like that. So thank you once again, Carola. Really interesting talk, and I can already see that, you know, the beginnings of the discussions later through these first questions. That's brilliant.